Hi everyone. Today we're going to cover Chapter 8 from American Pageant, and we're going to be focusing primarily on the decision of the colonies to go to war against Britain. Let's start with the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is June of 1775. Now, we have already talked about Lexington and Concord being the first armed conflict, but the Battle of Bunker Hill is also going to be significant for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it's a misnomer. It didn't actually happen at Bunker Hill. It happened at Breed's Hill, which is nearby in the section of Charlestown just north of Boston. And what's really interesting about this battle is that it was really a battle that both sides had prepared for. A colonial militia from Massachusetts fortified Breed's Hill, and the British forces attacked the colonists' position and ended up taking the hill, but in the process of doing that suffered over 1,000 casualties. And so even though technically it was a colonial loss, it was considered a victory because of how many casualties they were able to mount up. And so the other thing that to understand about Bunker Hill is that there's a famous quote that comes out of it, which is "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." And this was a colonial general named Israel Putnam that gave this warning. A lot of people misunderstand what he meant by this. Some people think that "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes" means don't fire unless they fire on you. So wait up until the last second where they're so close that you have no choice but to defend yourself. But what he actually meant was wait until they get close enough that you won't miss when you fire on them, because these guns could actually be pretty inaccurate, and he wanted to make sure that if we were going to waste gunpowder and shot, that we were going to hit our targets. So "don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes" can be misinterpreted as being more pacifist than it really is. He's basically saying don't shoot unless you know you're going to kill someone when you shoot. And around the same time as Bunker Hill, we see the meeting of the Second Continental Congress, which they had promised to do earlier and during the first meeting. And during this meeting, they're going to make some important decisions. It's important to note that Congress is still divided. They're not 100% behind going to war against Britain, and there's a big contingent of that group that still wants to try to make a last-ditch peace effort with England. So one group of delegates that wanted to go to war was mainly the New England delegates, and those delegates tended to be the most radical. But another group that was mainly from the middle colonies were hoping that they could resolve the conflict by negotiating a new relationship with Great Britain, and by doing this, they thought that maybe they could avoid all-out war. The Congress also adopted something called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities for Taking Up Arms, and then they ended up calling on the different colonies to provide troops for a central military. And maybe the most key decision they made was that George Washington was appointed to be commander-in-chief of the new colonial army, and then sent up to Boston where most of the fighting was going on. Congress also thought that it would be a good idea to have a command north going towards Quebec, and so they put Benedict Arnold in charge of that with the mission to raid Quebec in order to draw Canada away from the British Empire, kind of a divide and conquer method. And an American Navy and Marine Corps was organized in the fall of 1775 for the purpose of attacking British shipping and trying to cut them off. It's also important to notice that there were some peace efforts that were made, and maybe the most key is being the drafting of what's called the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition is basically like a draft of the grievance list that's attached to the Declaration of Independence, as a way of basically saying, if you will address our petitions, then we will back down. We won't use military force against you. But it's kind of like a last warning to the king, and of course the king again dismisses it. And so for those who were hoping to make peace, this was the final straw, and those who did not want to go to war ended up having to kind of take that position. I think we should also note the influence of Common Sense, which is the pamphlet written by Thomas Paine. We're doing a close reading and a Hips analysis of that in class, so I'm not going to get into too much of it right now. But along with the etching that was made by Paul Revere, this is most likely the thing that got colonists convinced that separation from Britain was necessary. And so this was a bestseller in 1776. It's full of influences from the Enlightenment, ideas from Locke, ideas from Rousseau, and it is propaganda. It's definitely pro-independence propaganda, but it's really well written and it's very convincing. And so some of the quotes that stand out I think this first one is one of the most important ones. To be always running 3,000 or 4,000 miles with a tale or a petition, waiting 4 or 5 months for an answer, which, when obtained, requires 5 or 6 more to explain it, will in a few years be looked upon as folly and childishness. It really kind of points out the ridiculousness of having a government so far removed and the fact that nothing can really get done in this current state. So you're going to get a lot more out of common sense when you do your analysis of it, but I just want to point out that all this stuff is happening at the same time. And then by July of 1776, we're now talking about full-on independence, and this is when Thomas Jefferson agrees to be the head of a committee that's going to write the document. John Adams is going to have some influence in editing it. Ben Franklin's also going to be involved in looking it over. But the Declaration of Independence, of course, is a major turning point in American history, really in world history, because for the first time you have a colonial body, a colonial group of subjects standing up to the mother country and saying that you no longer are ruling us in our best interest and we wish to separate. We're going to do a close reading of the Declaration of Independence next class. I think you guys know most of it, and I did mention in class the other day that it was heavily influenced by the ideas of John Locke, the social contract, natural rights to life, liberty, and property, which Jefferson changes to pursuit of happiness. So let's talk about where the colonists were at leading into the actual war. First of all, just to give you a breakdown of where the loyalties were, only about 40% of the colonists were behind the Patriot cause. So only about 40% were really supportive of a war for independence. 20 to 30% of the colonists were still loyalists, which meant that they wanted to remain attached to Britain in some way, shape, or form. Keep in mind that the Patriots have a little bit of a disadvantage here because they tend not to be the people who have the positions of power, and they tend not to be the people who have most of the wealth. You're more likely to be loyal or stay loyal to Britain if you are of the upper class and if you make a lot of money, especially in trade, because severing the relationship with Britain is going to hurt your ability to earn money. If you are a royal governor, if you are a high-ranking member of the Anglican Church, you are not going to want to break from Britain because you're going to lose your status. Okay, so that's why there were so many people who wanted to remain loyal. War is uncertain. There's no guarantee that you're going to win it, and there's no guarantee that things are going to be better when it's over. And that was something that was weighing on the colonists. Remember that the patriots who were fighting and the militias who were fighting, as you saw in the video we watched in class, they're poorly trained, they don't have a lot of supplies, and in terms of numbers, they don't number as many as the British troops at first. Remember that the British military is the strongest in the world at this point in history. George Washington never had more than 20,000 regular troops under his command at any one time, whereas the British had tens of thousands, 100,000 plus troops, not all used at the same time, but definitely at their disposal. In terms of where you would find the Patriots and the Loyalists most likely in the colonies, you're going to find Patriots are going to be centered mainly in New England and in Virginia, and Loyalists are going to be primarily in the middle colonies, especially of New York and New Jersey. And kind of interestingly enough, there's a big contingent of them in Georgia as well. African Americans did play a role. They weren't initially going to be allowed to serve in the army, but Britain promised African Americans who sided with them that they'd get their freedom, and so it was kind of incumbent on the Americans to also offer something similar to try to get African Americans on their side. But many African Americans that fought for the Patriot cause were already free blacks. Native Americans tried to stay out of it, but in the end they had to make a decision about what was in their best interest going forward, and they remembered how the French and Indian War went, and they remembered that after that the British had kept their promise to protect their lands by drawing the Proclamation Line, whereas the colonists kept violating that line and settling in the West. And so many of the Native Americans felt that it would make sense to side with the British because the British at least had tried to protect their lands. This map shows the three basic theaters of the war. You've got a northern theater, which includes Quebec and New England. You've got a middle theater, which kind of is mostly centered around New York and New Jersey. And then you've got a southern theater. And they happen in that order. And I think it's important to realize that once the Northern Theater has kind of wrapped up with the Battle of Saratoga, we see a major shift, and that major shift has to do with France coming in on the side of the colonists. We'll get to that in a minute. The early part of the war goes pretty poorly for the colonists. They lose both Boston and New York, which are their main harbors, to the British. And the only real saving grace is that General Washington is able to cross the Delaware River at the battles of Trenton and Princeton and spring a surprise attack at Trenton on soldiers who are kind of a little bit under the weather after their Christmas celebrations. See, one of the things that the colonists knew was that the British were hiring mercenary soldiers from Germany, known as the Hessians. And they knew that the Hessians, being Christian, were going to be celebrating Christmas, and they were probably going to drink a little bit, and that they'd be able to spring a surprise attack on them while they were still getting over their hangovers the day after Christmas. And so they crossed the Delaware River, the icy cold Delaware River, in the middle of the night, and they spring a surprise attack on the Hessian soldiers, who were in exactly the state that they thought they would be. And so this is now one of George Washington's most famed battles and most famed victories, and it's been made an American icon and through paintings and through films and things like that. Washington settles in with his troops at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for a really tough winter. And decides that he needs to sort of motivate them somehow, and morale's really low, but he needs to motivate them somehow. These guys had nothing. They were low on supplies, they were low on food, some of them had no shoes, some of them had very little clothing, and they're trying to just make it through the winter. And so Washington is not in a position for success here, but still, as a great motivator and as a great leader, he's able to use the small victories that they gain to have his men press on. Key turning point in the war that needs to be mentioned, though, is the Battle of Saratoga. Because what the Battle of Saratoga does is, number one, it's a major defeat for the British. They're trying to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies by encircling it from multiple sides. And instead, the colonists are able to mount a strong counterattack in upstate New York, and they win. And Ben Franklin goes to France and makes a plea to the French to join the side of the colonists. And the French are convinced, after the victory at the Battle of Saratoga, that they could do this. They want to get some of their land back and maybe weaken their enemy, Britain, because remember, they lost the French and Indian War to Britain. And so Ben Franklin's trying to use this strategy to bring the French in on the side of the colonists. And so they openly form an alliance with the American colonists after the Battle of Saratoga, and they're eventually able to pull in some of the other allies from Europe that are against Britain, namely Spain and the Netherlands. So this is a huge turning point, because now the United States has foreign help from a world power that has a navy and has a well-trained army, and that's going to be huge. The war shifts to the south later in the last few years, and you see that reinforcements are coming down from New York to try to shore up Savannah and Charleston. But that basically, the Southern strategy is hopefully that there are going to be more loyal British citizens in the South. And there are in some cases, not so much Virginia, but in the Carolinas and Georgia. And the British are counting on the fact that they're going to have help. And they don't get as much help as they anticipate. And so the final battle is at Yorktown in Virginia, and General Cornwallis of the British surrenders to George Washington and his troops, and an almost unthinkable victory for the colonists. But you notice on the map that you've got French naval ships all throughout Chesapeake Bay, and this is huge because it basically shows the British that they're surrounded on two sides. They're surrounded on land by the colonial army, they're surrounded by sea by the French Navy. And so without French help, I think it's pretty easy to say that the British could have won this thing, and it was the French that turned the tide in the favor of the colonists. The outcome is the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, which makes America an independent country. It cites the Mississippi River as the westernmost boundary. It allows fishing rights for the Americans off the coast of Canada, and a promise that Americans will pay any debts owed to the British and to any loyalists at the end. Now, obviously, this is a huge victory, but there's still a lot of work left for the colonists to do, including writing a government, which we'll get to in our next lesson.